Welcome back to Investing Talk Podcast. Today, we're opening up the source documents on a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company, Trevi Therapeutics.
That's right.
They're really zeroing in on developing their lead drug candidate, Haduvio, for some pretty tough chronic cough conditions. We've dug through a stack of their materials, financial reports, investor updates, trial results, summaries, to pull out the essential nuggets of knowledge and insight. Just for you.
And our mission for this session is to really unpack what they're working on.
Yeah, understand the recent news around their clinical trials and sort of figure out what it all might mean, both from a business angle and maybe more importantly for patients.
Absolutely. We're talking about a problem that, affects millions, but often goes overlooked until you or someone you know is really suffering from it.
So let's start there then. The sources make it pretty clear Trevi is tackling a huge unmet need. When you hear chronic cough, you might think, oh, it's just annoying, right? But these documents, they show it's a significant, often debilitating issue. What specific conditions are we talking about, and why are the current options so limited?
Okay, so the sources highlight two key areas they're focused on. First is refractory chronic cough, or RCC.
RCC, okay.
Think of this as a cough that it doesn't respond to standard medical treatments. And the really striking point the sources make is that for RCC, there are currently no approved therapies anywhere in the U.S.
No approved therapies. Wow, that's a major gap.
It absolutely is. And the second area is chronic cough associated with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, or IPF. Yeah, IPF is a serious lung scarring disease. The sources state that chronic cough affects a huge proportion of these IPF patients, something like up to 85% of the estimated 150,000 U.S. patients.
85%.
Yeah, and for many of them, it's incredibly severe. One detail that really stuck with me from the sources is that some individuals are coughing, get this, up to 1,500 times a day.
1,500 coughs a day.
Yeah.
Just picturing that sounds exhausting, let alone living it.
Exactly.
What kind of impact do the sources say this has on patients' lives?
It's not just tiring, it's profoundly disruptive. The sources detail these debilitating effects. Complications like urinary incontinence, really severe sleep disruption, social embarrassment.
Oh, man.
It places a significant burden, not just on the patients themselves, but, on their families as well. It impacts their quality of life in a really fundamental way.
Okay, so with that understanding of just how desperate the need is, let's look at how Trevi is attempting to tackle it. Their lead candidate is Haduvio. What exactly is it, and how does it work, according to the sources?
So Trevi's lead investigational therapy is Haduvio. It's an oral formulation of nalbuphine ER.
Nalbuphine ER.
Right. And the sources explain its mechanism as acting as a kappa agonist and mu antagonist. You'll often see it abbreviated as KAMA.
On KAMA. Okay, what does that mean in sort of simpler terms?
Essentially, it interacts with certain opioid receptors in the body and brain. These receptors play a key role in controlling the cough reflex, but also in how we perceive things like pain and reward. Haduvio targets these in a specific way, acting both centrally, in the brain and peripherally out in the body to hopefully dampen that urge to cough.
So hitting it from both angles.
Kind of, yeah. And an interesting detail noted in the sources is that unlike many substances acting on opioid receptors, nalbuphine is not currently scheduled by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency.
Huh. That's an interesting point about the scheduling.
Oh,
okay,
yeah.
Let's look at how this potential solution has actually performed in trials so far. The sources contain some recent, pretty exciting news about one of Haduvio's trials, the Phase 2A River trial. This was for refractory chronic cough. How was that study designed?
Right, the River trial. It was designed as a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study. Pretty standard, high-quality design.
Okay.
It used a crossover design, which is interesting. 2 treatment periods, each lasting 21 days, separated by a 21-day washout period in between.
So patients got both treatments at different times?
Exactly. They were carefully titrated through different doses. 27 milligrams, then 54 milligrams, and finally 108 milligrams, all taken twice daily. And to get really precise data, the study used an objective cough monitor called the VitaloGK to count coughs around the clock.
VitaloGK. Got it. And what were the headline results from that study? Did Haduvio actually work?
Yes. According to the sources, Haduvio met its primary endpoint. It showed a statistically significant reduction in objective 24-hour cough frequency.
Okay, significant reduction. How much?
The numbers are quite compelling, a 67% reduction from baseline. So patients were coughing less than a third as much as when they started the treatment period.
Wow, a 67% reduction is substantial. How did that compare to the placebo group, though? Because there's always a placebo effect with cough.
That's a great point. On a placebo-adjusted basis, the reduction was 57%. And both that reduction from baseline and the placebo-adjusted reduction were highly statistically significant. We're talking p-values less than 0.0001.
Okay, P 0.0001. That level of statistical significance is, well, it's strong validation, isn't it?
It really is.
What about different severities of cough? Did it work just for the worst cases or across the board?
The sources report positive results across different cough severity subgroups as well. They saw a 66% reduction in severe cough that's defined as over 20 coughs per hour,
Okay.
and a 68% reduction in moderate cough, which is 10 to 19 coughs per hour. And both of those subgroup results were also statistically significant, same p-value.
Impressive consistency. And how many patients actually saw a meaningful benefit? Because, reducing the average cough frequency is one thing, but how many people really felt the difference?
This is a key point from the sources. 84% of patients on Haduvio had at least a 30% reduction in their 24-hour cough frequency compared to baseline.
84%.
Yeah, compare that to only 29% of placebo patients who saw that level of reduction.
That's a huge difference.
It is. That's a 55% difference between the groups, which again was highly statistically significant. That really indicates a strong response rate among the treated patients.
An 84% responder rate at that 30% threshold is quite notable. And how quickly did patients start feeling this effect? Was it something that took weeks?
No, the sources show the effects were actually pretty fast. A statistically significant reduction was observed as early as day 7.
Day 7, even at the lowest dose.
Even at the lowest dose tested, the 27 milligram twice daily. And importantly, patient-reported outcomes for cough severity and frequency also showed statistically significant improvement compared to placebo starting as early as day 7.
So rapid onset and a high proportion of responders, that sounds promising. What about the safety profile in this river trial? Were there any unexpected issues or red flags?
Based on the sources we looked at, the safety profile on the river trial was generally consistent with what they'd seen in previous studies of Haduvio. The most common adverse events reported included things like constipation, nausea, somnolence, drowsiness, headache, dizziness, and fatigue.
Sort of typical side effects you might see with drugs affecting the central nervous system.
Somewhat, yes. But it's important to note that the sources mentioned there were no treatment-emergent serious adverse events reported in this specific trial.
That's reassuring data, particularly the lack of serious adverse events. Okay, so building on these positive results in refractory chronic cough, the focus naturally shifts to their ongoing trial in IPF patients, right?
Exactly.
The sources indicate another major catalyst is just around the corner. Results from the CORAL trial in IPF patients with chronic cough. What's the latest status on this crucial study?
This is their Phase 2b CORAL trial. Enrollment was completed earlier this year, back in February 2025.
Okay.
And the last visit was completed in April 2025, so the trial itself is done.
Right, so the data is being analyzed now.
Precisely. And the crucial timing everyone is watching for is the anticipated top-line results, which are expected sometime this quarter, the second quarter of 2025.
This quarter, so very soon.
Very soon. In fact, one source specifically highlights a conference call and webcast scheduled for June 2nd, 2025, where they plan to present these results.
June 2nd, 2025. Okay, that's a date circles on many calendars, I imagine. Briefly, how is the CORAL trial designed? Is this different patient population, IPF versus RCC?
Right. The CORAL trial is also placebo-controlled, but it uses a parallel arm design.
Parallel arm, meaning?
Meaning patients are randomized to a specific dose of Haduvio or placebo for the entire study period, rather than crossing over like in River.
Got it.
They're assessing the same 3 doses, 27 milligrams, 54 milligrams, and 108 milligrams, twice daily over a 6-week treatment period following a 2-week titration phase. And it's a larger study than River. Nearly 160 patients were randomized.
Okay. And the main goal, same endpoint.
The primary efficacy endpoint is similar to River. The relative change in 24-hour cough frequency at the end of week 6 compared to baseline, again using that objective vital JK cough monitor. They're also looking at secondary endpoints like patient-reported outcomes.
And the sources mentioned some management insights about this trial, something about dropout rates.
Yes, one source noted management commentary suggesting potentially lower discontinuation rates in coral compared to some earlier IPF studies they might have done.
Why is that?
They attributed this to strategies aimed at helping patients manage any potential side effects better, which, could be an important factor not just in trial success, but thinking ahead to real-world use too.
Makes sense. Patient compliance is key. Given the, as you said, absolute lack of approved therapies for chronic cough associated with IPF, how significant are these upcoming coral results if they turn out positive?
Oh, they are extremely significant, hugely important. Positive outcomes here could be the critical step that paves the way for pivotal phase 3 studies.
The final step before seeking approval.
Exactly. Successfully demonstrating efficacy and safety in this larger, well-controlled trial could potentially offer a much-needed treatment option for these IPF patients whose lives are just so severely impacted by chronic cough. And remember, Haduvio has shown a statistically significant reduction in cough frequency in previous, smaller IPF trials.
Right.
So these upcoming results are really crucial to confirm that benefit at scale and, keep the program moving forward.
Okay. Beyond the clinical story, which is clearly the main focus here, the sources also give us a peek into Trevi's financial health and business position. What did you find in the numbers?
Looking at the Q1 2025 report that came out May 8th, 2025, the financial snapshot shows, a net loss of $10.3 million for the quarter.
Which is pretty normal for a clinical stage biotech, right? They're investing heavily.
Absolutely typical. It was actually a slight improvement compared to the $10.9 million loss in Q1 2024. Their earnings per share was negative $0.09 versus negative $0.11 year over year. And as you said, as a clinical stage company, it's expected not to see significant revenue figures or, traditional revenue growth.
Right. What about their cash position? Do they have the resources to keep funding these trials, especially if coral is positive and they need to plan for phase 3?
That's the key question. According to the sources, they ended Q1 2025 with a pretty solid cash position, $103.3 million in cash, cash equivalents, and marketable securities.
Okay, over $100 million. How long is that expected to last?
Management provided guidance expecting this cash runway to extend into the fourth quarter of 2026.
Q4 2026, so that covers them through these coral results and potentially into phase 3 planning.
Yes, exactly. This was described by management as a strong balance sheet that provides flexibility. Looking quickly at expenses, R&D costs decreased slightly, mainly due to lower costs for a study that finished up. G&A expenses increased slightly, mostly personnel costs. And the sources suggest the company has more cash than debt, pointing to a strong financial footing at this stage. Again, typical for a biotech reinvesting heavily in R&D. PE ratios, ROE, those aren't really applicable here.
Okay, so they seem funded through the next key catalysts and likely beyond. What about their place in the broader market? Any relevant industry trends mentioned in the sources?
Well, the sources position Trevi's competitive advantage in their focus on these highly underserved conditions like RCC and IPF. There just aren't good options.
I need that unmet need again.
Their market position is really that of a focused challenger within the biotech sector, specifically in respiratory and maybe pain management areas. Relevant industry trends touched upon include, the growing demand for innovative treatments in respiratory diseases,
Which makes sense.
the increasing importance of demonstrating cost effectiveness for new therapies, and just the general impact of regulatory pathways. One source did note the company's stock performance, showing significant growth around 150% over the past year.
150%, that's quite a run-up.
It is, but the source also correctly points out that biotech stocks are inherently volatile. So past performance isn't indicative, etc. And as expected for a company at this stage focused on R&D, no dividends are paid out. All capital goes back into research.
Okay, so what does all this paint for the road ahead? Looking forward, what are the major risks and opportunities facing Trevi based on these sources?
Well, the risks are pretty familiar ones for a clinical stage biotech. The primary risk, number one, is the unpredictable nature of clinical trial outcomes.
Meaning the coral results might not be positive.
Exactly. Or maybe not positive enough to clearly justify moving straight to phase 3. There are also regulatory challenges involved in gaining approval. Even with positive data, the FDA always has questions. And of course, potential competition down the line if other companies succeed in these spaces.
Any other risks mentioned?
Not specifically detailed for Trevi in these sources, but general biotech risks always apply. Things like manufacturing hurdles, supply chain issues, or intellectual property disputes could theoretically become factors.
Okay, and the opportunities. What's the upside if things, go well?
The opportunities are really the flip side of those risks. if the CORAL trial and then potentially future phase 3 trials are successful.
Big if, but okay.
Big if, yes. But the potential exists for regulatory approvals for Haduvio. That would allow them to address these really significant unmet medical needs in large patient populations, both RCC and IPF cough.
And that translates to?
It could mean potentially improving the lives of tens, maybe even hundreds of thousands of patients suffering from severe chronic cough with a novel, first-in-class kind of therapy in some cases.
That's certainly a powerful motivator. Okay, bring it all back to the near term. What are the absolute key upcoming events that could really impact the company's trajectory, according to the sources? What should people be watching?
The most immediate and, frankly, the most significant event, reiterated across multiple sources, is that webcast scheduled for June 2nd, 2025.
June 2nd, presenting the CORAL trial top-line results.
That date is crucial. Everything hinges on that, near term. Beyond that, the company is participating in other conferences. In June 2025, the American Cough Conference, the CPD annual scientific meeting where they'll present some abuse potential data for nalbuphine.
Oh, interesting.
And the Bio International Convention for a corporate presentation. So a busy June. The sources also note that based on the positive river data in RCC, the company is actively designing its next planned trial for that condition as well.
So potentially moving forward on two fronts if CORAL is positive.
Potentially, yes. Ultimately, the successful trial outcomes are the gateways to potential regulatory submissions further down the line.
Right. So we've journeyed through these sources, exploring the significant, often underestimated problem of chronic cough, Trevi Therapeutics' unique approach with Haduvio, the promising Phase 2A river trial results in RCC, the eagerly anticipated Phase 2B CORAL trial results in IPF just around the corner, and the company's financial position and future outlook.
The information we reviewed suggests that Haduvio, with its specific common mechanism and the data seen so far, particularly in RCC, could be a genuinely differentiated therapy addressing substantial unmet needs if it continues to demonstrate efficacy and safety in these upcoming and future clinical readouts.
It's a big if, but the potential impact is clear. If you found this discussion valuable, please do consider subscribing, liking, and leaving a comment. Your feedback really helps us understand what matters most to you. The journey of bringing a new therapy to patients is just so complex, isn't it? Filled with scientific challenges, financial hurdles, regulatory gates. Trevi Therapeutics is navigating that path right now for chronic cough. So here's a thought to leave you with. What aspects of this whole process, from the deep science behind the cough reflex itself to the massive impact clinical data can have on a company's future, what stands out most to you?